Hello and good evening, everyone. I'm Yaron Ayalon, Director of the Yaschik Arnold Jewish Studies Program and Associate Professor of Jewish and Middle Eastern Studies at the College of Charleston. I'd like to welcome you to another Jewish Studies event sponsored by the Norman and Jerry Sue Arnold Center for Israel Studies here at the college. Before we begin, just a reminder that today's talk is part of a long series of events that our program is hosting this semester, and they're all virtual and they're all free. If tonight our topic is Ethiopian Jews, our next two conversations will deal with Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. First, this Sunday, the 21st at 1 p.m., with Dr. Devin Nahr, the University of Washington, about racism within the Jewish world towards Sephardim. And then 2 days later, on Tuesday the 23rd, this is a kind of a lunch talk, 12:30 p.m., with Dr. Michal Bitton about Sephardic Jews in the U.S. And political questions. Should get pretty interesting. Information about these and many other upcoming events and links to register for them via Zoom are all found on our website at jewish.cfc.edu/events and on our Facebook page. And those links to these will appear in the chat shortly. Now for tonight's event, I'll introduce our speaker, after which we will he will give us an introduction for about 20 minutes or so, followed by questions that you may submit in the chat directly to Kim or to myself. You may start doing that right now, that we can then present those questions to our speaker. And as for our speaker, Professor Don Seeman is Associate Professor in the Department of Religion at the Tom Institute for Jewish Studies at Emory University. He's the author of One People, One Blood, Ethiopian-Israelis and the Return to Judaism. It came out with Rutgers University Press in 2009, and co-editor of the Contemporary Anthropology of Religion series at Belgrade. Professor Seeman has written extensively in the areas of religion, anthropology, and Jewish studies. He also gives really good advice if you're like an early career scholar. I just want to say that's from personal experience. His research focus includes modern Jewish thought and mysticism, medical anthropology, and the ethnography of contemporary Israel. He received his PhD in social and medical anthropology from Harvard University in 1997, and also taught previously at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Professor Seeman, it's a pleasure to have you with us. And we'll start with your introduction, please.
Thank you, Yaron. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, I'm going to ask you to mute yourselves so we don't have background noise, and anybody who's willing to turn on your camera so that I don't feel like I'm talking to a blank screen. It's very good to be here. Thank you to Yaron and Kim. I visited Charleston a number of years ago, but haven't had a chance to get back, so this is the best alternative. As Yaron mentioned, I'm an anthropologist, and I've spent many years already in and out of the Ethiopian Jewish community in Israel as part of my research. And after all these years, really not just as research anymore, but as part of my life. Some of my closest friends are members of that community going back, I don't want to say how many years already. I began doing field work when I was a college student working on a senior thesis in between my junior and senior years. And I went to a town in the Galilee and wound up living with a family for 3 months. And since then, it's become a consistent part of my scholarship. It's not the only thing that I do, but I keep on coming back to it. One of the things that I'm writing about right now is what I call the religious renaissance of the Ethiopian Jewish community. And I want to spend just a few minutes explaining what I mean by that, and then hopefully we'll have a robust discussion. I don't know how much any of you know about the Ethiopian Jewish community, but this is a community that began immigrating to Israel in earnest in the mid-1980s in a secret airlift known at the time as Operation Moses. That was shut down prematurely, leaving a lot of people trapped on different sides of the border, not in touch with their families, and so forth. It wasn't until 1991 that a major airlift was able to take place again, bringing another 15,000 or so people to Israel, the largest civilian airlift in history, in just over the course of 24 hours. And just in literally the closing hours of the communist regime in Ethiopia that was being toppled by rebels, and literally as the army left and the rebels came in, the Israeli planes were taking off and bringing people to Israel. And then since 1991, there's been a steady but consistent trickle of further individuals who were not recognized as Jewish at the time by the state of Israel, but who have come to Israel either under family reunification statutes or by convincing the state that they were on the wrong list or something like that. And those people came since 1991 are now the majority of the Ethiopian population in Israel today. It's a large young community. I think something like 50% of the people in the Ethiopian Jewish community are under 35. And that's because the previous generation had a lot of children. And I want to say something about their sort of religious life to just put in context what I'm calling the Renaissance. If I go back to 1988, when I first went to Upper Nazareth, the Galilee town where I did field research, I was meeting people who had immigrated 4 or 5 years before, not more. Many of them had spent significant time in refugee camps in the Sudan, which was not pleasant. All of them had lost relatives on the trek from Ethiopia to Sudan and then to Israel. And it was a community that felt very strongly its ethos, its religious ethos, and its connection to Israel, but was very frustrated by what it felt was a lack of reception or an improper reception on the part of Jews elsewhere or Jews from elsewhere. Remember that for many years, the government of Israel had not recognized the Jewishness of Ethiopian Jews at all. That wasn't a matter of the Rabbanut. That was the position of the secular state of Israel. It was only with the ascension of Menachem Begin in 1977 and the ruling of Chief Rabbi Ovadia Yosef preceding that in 1973 that the state began taking seriously the claim of Ethiopian Jews to fall under the rubric of the law of return. But despite being brought to Israel under the law of return, when they arrived, they had some rude awakenings. So the chief rabbinate at the time was no longer controlled by Ovadia Yosef. He had been forced out in a political maneuver by the establishment. It used to be a life position. They turned it into a 10-year position, largely to stem his growing influence and power. He founded, of course, the Shas party, which worked a revolution in Israeli politics. And the Rabbanut at the time when most Ethiopians came ruled that there's a little bit complicated, but basically they ruled that although they had Jewish origins, there was question about their lineage. And therefore, all the members of the Ethiopian community ought to undergo a kind of what's called conversion from doubt, gior misafek or gior lechumra, a kind of conversion for the sake of strictness, which is a modified form of the conversion that anybody seeking to convert to Judaism would undergo before they would be allowed to marry other Jews or be treated fully as members of the Jewish community. The Ethiopian community was very bitter about this, almost universally bitter about this. Nevertheless, a large number, especially the earlier immigrants, acceded to the rabbinate's request or demand, but many of the later immigrants did not. And so there emerged in places like Upper Nazareth a kind of two-tier system in which, for example, if there was a wedding, even between members of the Ethiopian community, the wedding would have to be solemnized by somebody recognized by the state. In other words, somebody recognized by the chief rabbinate. There's no civil marriage in Israel. The rabbinate at the time allowed this to happen only through the good offices of the chief rabbi of Netanya, who was a Yemenite rabbi who happened to rule that Ethiopians should be counted as Jews. So he was allowed to sort of do his own thing. But it meant that everybody who wanted a wedding license had to make the trek to Netanya to register with the Netanya rabbinate, no matter where they lived. After the sort of official state wedding, they would bring in religious leaders, the kesim, their own hereditary priests, to perform an Ethiopian wedding, which was considered a very big problem by all sides, both by the rabbinate, by the Ethiopian community. They all considered it a mess, but nobody quite knew what to do with it. At that time in Upper Nazareth, there were no predominantly Ethiopian synagogues, but Ethiopians regularly prayed in synagogues that were controlled by Moroccans, who were the largest group of non-Ashkenazi, non-secular Jews in Upper Nazareth at the time. It was a pretty secular town for a development town, but the Moroccans were traditional, like Moroccans in many places are. But you would walk into a synagogue, you would see Ethiopians holding the prayer book upside down because they didn't know how to read Hebrew. Synagogues might or might not count them in a minyan. They didn't really know the orders of prayer in Hebrew. It's not what they were familiar with from Ethiopia. And there was a great sense of dissatisfaction and bewilderment. On the other hand, formative parts of the Ethiopian Jewish religious tradition could no longer be practiced. There was no animal sacrifice practiced in Israel. The ritual separation of men and women during their menstrual cycles was not really possible. In Ethiopia, women went to a separate hut during the time of their menses. That was very difficult to maintain in Israel, and nobody really wanted to support them in doing so, including the Orthodox community, for whom that's not a contemporary practice. There were disputes over what food you could eat, so that the rabbinate did not recognize Ethiopian slaughter of meat because they have slightly different rules from those practiced in Rabbinic Judaism. But some Ethiopians wouldn't eat meat slaughtered under the auspices of the rabbinate. So there were different slaughtering systems going on. If you had a big party, you might buy a goat and then hire someone to come slaughter it for you personally. If you had guests who were not Ethiopians, they might or might not eat. There was a lot of this kind of ritual confusion, which was compounding the sort of general cultural confusion that is suffered very often by immigrants to any society, including Israel. Now, if you had asked me at the time, and I wrote, so you can check me on this, and if you had asked basically any academic scholar at the time, they would have told you that the future, if they could look 20 years into the future, would look something like this. A percentage of Ethiopians, 10, 15, 20%, like the rest of Israelis, would choose to become Orthodox and identify with that community in one form or another. The majority would become what in Israel is called Masorti, like most Sephardim. In other words, a respect for tradition, some practices, but not strict adherence to Jewish law. And a small minority, maybe around the same minority as became Orthodox, would become secular. And that was the pattern that had been seen in some other Sephardic communities. And that seemed to be the way that Ethiopian Jewry was heading. Everybody knew that the Ethiopian Jewish tradition itself would not survive in Israel. The institutions didn't exist to help it survive. Nobody really wanted it to survive in Israel. And young Ethiopians, to the extent that they wanted to become more Israeli, if they had religious impulses, expressed them in Hebrew, not in Amharic. They went to religious schools where they were taught Rabbinic Judaism, not traditional Ethiopian Judaism, which is non-Rabbinic. And that seemed to be the way the wind was blowing. And that was a source of sadness to some people and satisfaction to others. The whole story of the Ethiopian immigration for 100 years before that had been characterized by tension, not only over religious identity, but also over religious practice. What constitutes Judaism? Already, Rabbinic Judaism had begun to make some inroads into Ethiopia before immigration, and obviously that picked up steam afterwards. Some Ethiopian Jews had converted to Christianity in Ethiopia. Their fate was also uncertain. Many of them, after the immigration in 1984-85, wanted to move to Israel and return to Judaism, but it was unclear whether they would be accepted either by the rabbinate or by their own communities that often considered them traitors for having converted to Christianity. So there were many, many, many question marks. Okay, now fast forward to around 2010. I'm in Israel on sabbatical, and I'm doing some research in the Ethiopian community, although that's not my focus that year. I was working on Chabad Hasidism. But I was invited to a family wedding. So I went back to Upper Nazareth, where I had spent so much time. Many of my friends still live there. If not them, then their parents. The people sort of my age had parents who still lived there. And they had come for this big family wedding. The wedding itself was held in Tel Aviv, 600 people. I was like the only white guy there. Everybody thought I was a waiter. It was held in a hall with a rabbi and the whole shebang. And then following that, everybody got in their cars or buses. They went back to Upper Nazareth and spent the weekend, sort of having a drumming and celebration and ululation and having a kind of Ethiopian wedding. Now, a couple of things had changed that I found remarkable and that had surprised me because honestly, I didn't see them creeping up. Although I'm now convinced that these are absolutely essential things to pay attention to in terms of the Ethiopian community's continued integration to Israel. First of all, the wedding was performed by an Ethiopian rabbi, in other words, by a rabbi registered by the chief rabbinate, but of Ethiopian ethnicity, right, of Ethiopian origin. There were now dozens of such people in the country. Second of all, when they went back to Upper Nazareth, they had invited a kes, or a Beta Israel Ethiopian Jewish priest, to solemnize the wedding there. He wasn't an old man. He was a young man, maybe in his 30s or 40s, and had been ordained by his father in Israel. That was something that had not really been happening before, but now has become commonplace. The Ethiopian kesim are little by little gaining the recognition of the state. Many of them have part-time salaries or synagogues paid for by the government. It's an ongoing political struggle and negotiation, but they're organized now. They have an organization, they levy political pressure, and they share with Ethiopian rabbis the mentoring or the fulfillment of spiritual needs of the Ethiopian Jewish community. And it's not uncommon for the same family to invite both a rabbi and a kes to solemnize a life cycle event, let's say. And the same families may have contact with both. There are some people who are strictly Orthodox or strictly traditional, but many, many people are mixing and matching in very interesting ways. Upper Nazareth now has two different Ethiopian-run synagogues. Okay, one is attended by almost nobody. It's run by a couple of priests who do the traditional prayers in Ethiopic or Ge'ez, and they meet at the crack of dawn. And ironically, acceded to the rabbinate's conversion demand and therefore lost credibility in their own community. But at the same time, there's an Ethiopian-run synagogue which looks, smells, sounds like a Moroccan synagogue, follows the Moroccan rite in all regards, but has only a few Moroccan attendees and is run by Ethiopian lay people without a rabbi. And they hold prayers in Hebrew on Shabbat morning, and then afterwards in Amharic for the older people. They have a meal, which is a traditional Ethiopian meal, no hot food, traditional bread, no blessing over wine, and so forth. But then in the afternoon, some of the teenagers who have been to yeshiva high schools gather for Seudah Shlishit, the third meal, which is not an Ethiopian custom. And there they sing kind of songs of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav and contemporary Israeli religious hits. Some of the people that I had met years ago have become members of other sects. Many are affiliated with the sort of Shas, Sephardic Haredi group. One young man that I met is now a Breslov Chassid who goes every year to the pilgrimage to Uman in Ukraine on Rosh Hashanah. He's not the only one. There's a group of people who do this, and he can speak quite eloquently about why Rabbi Nachman is the true Judaism and very much in sync with the Ethiopian tradition also as he understands it. A few have become Pentecostal Christians or Messianic Jews in Israel and live in a kind of, tension with the rest of the Ethiopian Jewish community, including their families, which may or may not be happy about what has become of them. I went to a brit, a circumcision, for the son of one Messianic Ethiopian Jew, and the circumcision was performed by a Haredi rabbi who I think had no idea what he was walking into, standard Israeli circumcision. But the different tables were set up for his biological family and his, quote, family in Christ, who didn't really talk to each other, but performed the circumcision, right, as something that was actually important to both groups, as an instantiation of kind of a Jewish nationality and Israelite religion, if you want to call it that. But they disputed what it meant. So over time, over the 20 or 30 years that I've been watching, I would say a couple of things have happened. One is that Ethiopian tradition did not disappear. If anything, it's grown stronger today, more organized, and younger. And the idea that this was somehow going away simply has not come to pass. And in fact, young, completely fluent in Hebrew, young kesim are being ordained and are beginning to take the stage in place of their parents and grandparents at public events, like the annual Chassid holiday, which is the only Ethiopian holiday that has made it onto the official Israeli calendar, right? It's now a school holiday, just like the Moroccan Maimuna and other kind of ethnic holidays. At the same time, and this is not really a contradiction, but it's been happening at the same time, Ethiopians have moved into practically every religious niche that exists in Israel. So there are modern Orthodox Ethiopians. There's even what I would call an open Orthodox Ethiopian rabbi. There's one conservative Ethiopian rabbi. There are secularists. There are mainstream Orthodox. There are Haredi Ethiopians. There are Breslov Hasidic Ethiopians. As far as I know, there are no Lubavitch Ethiopians, but that's only because Lubavitch had a particular problem with Ethiopian identity at the beginning, and they hold it against them. The mainstream Ashkenazi Haredi groups have not really warmed to Ethiopians. But Ethiopians can be found for sure in all of the Sephardic communities, everyone. And as time goes by, they're beginning to shape their own very distinctive but very Israeli form of Ethiopian Judaism. And just like many people, struggling to figure out how to pass on that tradition to their children while being Israeli in every way and becoming blue-collar workers, doctors, lawyers, college students, and just moving up that kind of social and educational and economic hierarchy, just like everybody else. People who spent their youth in refugee camps not knowing how to read in any language now have college degrees and master's degrees in many cases, more rarely PhDs, and they're buying apartments in the center of the country rather than at the periphery, which is losing population, right? As people who are able to move to Haifa, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and so forth. So this is a community that's really in flux, but it's a community whose religious experience has diversified and really flourished over the last number of decades. And I think, maybe I'll talk about this in the questions, but I think that looking at the Jewish community as a whole through the prism of Ethiopian Judaism as it exists today is actually very enlightening and can tell you something about the way that Judaism in general is developing and the role that Ethiopian Judaism is playing within that. It's a role that's active and not passive. And even though Ethiopians are still a small minority of Jews in general, of Israeli Jews in general, you can find them everywhere, engaged in every activity that any other Israeli is. That shouldn't be surprising when you think about it, but it was. I think it was surprising to a whole generation of scholars who thought about it, because that's not what they saw in the late 80s, the early 90s. There's really been a kind of revolution, I think, in the Ethiopian Jewish experience. For my money, it's all a good thing, and also very fascinating to think about as a scholar. Let me pause here, and then I'll take questions, comments, and we can get into other topics.
Great, thank you. This is really fascinating, and brings back all sorts of memories for me as a younger person living in Israel and seeing a lot of the things that you have mentioned. We have a few questions, and I'll just remind everyone, feel free to send questions to me or to Kim via the chat, and we'll get to these. But for now, let me start with this. you think we could say that the experience of the integration, or maybe not so great integration, of Ethiopian Jews in Israel was comparable in any way to that of the Sephardim or Mizrahim or Arab Jews that came in the early years of the state?
For sure, and that's a parallel that many people have made, both Ethiopians and others. But there are differences. For one thing, the Ethiopians immigrated in a different time. So by 1991, for sure, by the big immigration in 1991, the state was making a concerted effort to settle people in the center of the country and not at the periphery, because they felt that they had learned from the experience of the 50s, although they hadn't learned that in the 80s. But by the 90s, they had learned it. And they tried to settle people in the center of the country. On the other hand, the Mizrahim are a majority of the Israeli population. And under the influence of Shas, began to wield significant political power. Ethiopians are a small community who were, for a long time, party line Likud voters. Now they're more diversified. But they don't, even if they all vote together, have tremendous political power. And you see that from the fact that the major parties don't promote them very much within their ranks. When Ehud Barak became prime minister, he summarily, fired the primary Ethiopian member of the list who didn't quite make it. He pushed him down on the list to make room for somebody else. And the Ethiopian community yelled and screamed about it, but they really had no power to do anything about it. There are now 2 or 3 Ethiopian Chavrei Knesset, but they're there because of their political networking, not because the Ethiopian community really wields any power. Another difference is that although the Sephardic community may have been subject to some kinds of bias or bias against their form of Judaism in some ways, there was never any question but that it represented a legitimate form of rabbinic Judaism, with which Ashkenazi Jews, for example, had been in contact, back and forth by travel and by letter and exchange of scholarship over, hundreds of years. The Ethiopian community was starting with none of that. They had been in contact with Jews outside Ethiopia consistently for maybe 100 years, and that created all kinds of different problems. So whereas, a Moroccan from the very beginning could probably find a synagogue or a rabbi that corresponded to their sense of tradition, Ethiopians had to build that from scratch in Israel and against some opposition. Now, some Ethiopians and some Mizrahim have tried to make political common cause. You mentioned Arab Jews, which is, of course, a controversial way of describing it in Israel. And by the way, Palestinians sometimes have also tried to make common cause with Ethiopian Jews. For the most part, it hasn't worked. Ethiopian Jews are not Mizrahim, although they somehow get classed in that group, but their religious traditions are very different. Their sense of themselves ethnically is very different. And they don't want to identify with the underclass. They want to identify with the people who are most successful and, sort of climb the ladder that way. And many have been successful. There are frustrations, which we can talk about, but there's definite movement in that way. So it's a parallel model, but it's not exactly the same. And although I think most Ethiopians today do identify more with the kind of Mizrahi sector in terms of food and where they live and, the Israeli slang that they speak, they're cognizant of having a different tradition. I'm not sure there's any more intermarriage, for example, between Ethiopians and Mizrahim than there is between Ethiopians and Ashkenazim. I'm not sure if anybody has actually done a calculation of this, but to my sort of just untutored eye, I think it's probably about even.
Yeah, well, that actually leads me to my next question. I got to say, you touched upon a point that I too have seen in my work, that is the intense correspondence for centuries between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. I looked at it from the Sephardic point of view, and I have not seen even one example of an Ethiopian Jew involved in these conversations. My work is pre-19th century. It's just not there.
Right. Right.
But I wonder this. I wonder about this. Okay, you said before in your earlier comments that that Ethiopian Jews, in many ways, that their way of practicing Judaism was different. So I'd like to press you on this particular issue a little bit. Was the issue in the Israeli case of not recognizing Ethiopian Jews as Jews really? Was it really about something else? Was it not about Jewish traditions or whether they descended from Jews or how they practiced them, but about race?
Sure. Look, Yaron, it's difficult to disentangle these things. I think I'm more open to the argument about race now than I was 20 years ago, and I think more Ethiopians are open to it now than they were 20 years ago. And by the way, they follow very closely American politics. They're all familiar with Black Lives Matters and Floyd and all these kinds of American dynamics. And there's an interplay between Ethiopian self-consciousness and what they at least see in the media of African American experience, although it's not exactly the same. But let me just share my point of view. I think race played a secondary role in the sense that there were certainly people who just looked at them and said, "These guys can't be Jewish, right? They don't look Jewish, right?" But ironically, that was more of an issue in the secular establishment than it was in the religious establishment, by which I mean that the secular state, on completely non-religious grounds, classified the Ethiopian community as not Jewish from the beginning of the state, based on what they considered to be, quote, objective cultural grounds, whatever that means. And it was really only the intervention of the rabbinate under Ovadia Yosef that changed that. So whereas American Jews love to tell themselves the story about the terrible oppressive rabbinate and, the liberatory Israeli state, you could make the case that the opposite is true. And that Ethiopians had an easier time claiming identity on the part of Orthodox authorities than they did on the part of secular state authorities. I think that's still true, but that's something we could debate. I think that the question about Ethiopian Jewish identity was not a crazy question to ask, irrespective of race. Okay, let me just put it that way. Because race, I'm sure, played a role, but it wasn't a crazy question to ask. And that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, as you mentioned, there wasn't a lot of history of correspondence between Ethiopians and other Jewish communities. The major connection that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef used to justify his decision was a letter from the 16th rabbi of Egypt, Radbaz, David Abu Ibn Zimra. And the Radbaz was responding to a question from an Egyptian Jew who had purchased a slave from Habash, or Ethiopia. And the slave had told the Egyptian Jew that he was Jewish. And so the slave purchaser wrote to the chief rabbi and said, "What should I do? If this person is really Jewish, I have to manumit them. How should I consider them?" And the Radbaz sent back a response that said, "You should manumit them and treat them as a Jew." And then later on, the same person wrote and said, "Well, can my son marry her?" And then the Radbaz said, "Sure." So that's the legal tradition upon which this is all based, but there was no real communication before the 19th century. That, coupled with the fact that the form of Judaism practiced in Ethiopia was not a little different, but really vastly and drastically different from rabbinic Judaism, I think gave people ample reason on both sides, by the way, to wonder what their connection was with the other side. So when Western Jews first came to Ethiopia, it was not taken for granted that Ethiopians would recognize them as a part of their community. And it wasn't taken for granted that Ethiopians would be recognized as part of non-Ethiopian Judaism by the same token. Let me just give you, we're short on time, but let me just give you like a 2-second overview of this. The first real contact between Western Jews and Ethiopian Jews on a sustained level took place through the intermediary of Christian missionaries. Okay, Christian missionaries from the London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst the Jews, right? That's a title for you. Sometimes called just the London Jewish Society, which sounds kind of like a Hillel, but it's not. Sent missionaries to Ethiopia starting in 1860. a converted German Jew by the name of Henry Aaron Stern. And Stern was the first European to go around and make contact with all of these villages and begin telling Ethiopian Jews, look, I'm a Jew like you. I'm a white falasha from beyond the ocean. And it was only after he started preaching the New Testament to them that they sort of got, sort of cynical about this and eventually kicked him out. So when Western Jewish Jews came 2 decades later, at first they didn't want to accept them at all. They thought they were all Christian missionaries. And gradually, Jewish visitors convinced them that they weren't Christian. But it wasn't obvious that these were people who were related to each other, practiced the same religion. And the truth is that, and I've written about this, those Western writers who focused on race mostly claimed that Ethiopian Jews were not related to Jews outside Ethiopia. Mostly, it's not always true. Those European writers who focused on religious ritual and practice were the ones who mostly said that they are. But they also wanted the Ethiopian Jews to change their religious practices to be more in accordance with Rabbinic Judaism. Okay, so there's been a push and a pull for decades upon decades here. And race is certainly important. And it's important today in the following way. If you walk into a synagogue as a secular Jew without a kippah, right, a Hebrew-speaking Israeli, and you walk into any synagogue and you look vaguely white or Sephardic or something like that, so it'll be assumed that you're Jewish and you'll be treated as part of a minyan outside of the Haredi community I'm talking about, right? In sort of mainstream Israel. But if you walk in looking like an Ethiopian, many people look at you and already they have questions because they know that there's some problem about the Jewishness of Ethiopians and they can, you look different. So that's where this comes up, right? If you show up to put on tefillin at a Chabad, tefillin stand on Kikar Tzion, on Zion Square in Jerusalem, so they'll put tefillin on anybody, right? And anybody who walks up, right, who says I'm Jewish, who's a man, can put on tefillin. But when an Ethiopian walks up, they will give him tefillin, but they don't encourage it because they're identifiable as a group for whom there's a kind of a problem in a way that they don't set aside sort of Russian Jews, even though there's a large percentage of Russian Jews who are not Jewish by any stretch of the imagination. But the core community is recognized as Jewish, whereas the core community of Ethiopian Jews is what's in question. So I view this as a tragedy rather than a story with a villain. I think that everybody was asking questions that were fair to ask, but it put people on a collision course that was hard to avoid.
Huh. Well, fortunately for Ethiopian Jews, they had fairly liberal, I suppose, people to support them. Liberal in within the Orthodox world, that is, like Ovadia Yosef, who of course quoted Rajbaz, who was quite liberal for his time too.
Right.
But sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I mean, this was also part of power politics, right? Ovadia Yosef, claimed the jurisdiction to decide who's a Jew, and not only as chief rabbi, but even after being chief rabbi, this was an assertion of Sephardic authority. Mm-hmm. And when Ashkenazi rabbis wrote, like Moshe Feinstein from the United States, wrote that Ethiopian Jews probably needed to convert, Ovadia Yosef said, "Who are you? Who are you in New York? What do you know? Right? We're all Sephardim here together." Right, but it's not obvious that Ethiopian Jews saw themselves that way before this period.
So, okay, that's the religious angle. Then let's talk about Ethiopian Jews and the state. So, accepted or not accepted as Jews, today I think most Israelis do see them as Jews, even with those problems in mind that you mentioned. But there's still issues with respect to the way they regard the state or see the state. And I wonder if you mentioned this briefly at the beginning of your last answer about culturally following what's going on in the United States. Do we see these parallels? It appeared that we did when these anti-police demonstrations broke out. This was, I guess, a couple years ago. more or less at around the same time that we had demonstrations here as well. Are there those parallels? Is there connection also on a cultural level? Like, are Ethiopians listening more to Black music, for example, that comes from the United States? I mean, how far can we take that connection or those parallels between the Black experience here and the one of Ethiopians in Israel?
Yeah. Look, people have written about this. I think that there's an inverse relationship between the level of, I guess, religious orthodoxy of Ethiopian Jews and their level of racial identification with African Americans. So by that, I mean that there's a kind of a split. It's not so black and white, but there's sort of a split between those Ethiopian Jews who conceptualize their own existence more in religious terms and those who conceptualize it more in racial and ethnic terms. And I think that the more advanced secondary education you have, the more likely you are to use race as an explanatory theory than religion. And that's because, just like everywhere, secondary education has a secularizing effect and people are reading what's produced in English and all this kind of stuff. So when you look at sort of Facebook accounts of, Ethiopian professionals and college graduates, there's a lot of attention to what's going on in the United States. Black Lives Matter. If you go to a poor neighborhood in South Tel Aviv where there are Ethiopians, so you'll hear reggae music and that sort of thing. But when you sort of push people, they kind of fall back on a religious identity that binds them to other Jews. I think a breaking point for this was what I called the blood affair, which I wrote about, which was the political explosion that took place in 1996 when it was revealed that the Ministry of Health was not using blood donations taken from Ethiopian immigrants because of a concern over HIV and other infectious diseases, but hadn't been telling the Ethiopian community that.
Yeah.
In other words, they were sort of taking the blood, but not using it. And that led to a huge, massive, violent protest, the first violent protest that Ethiopians in Israel had had. And I think that was a turning point when it became acceptable to talk about race in the Ethiopian community. And they began to talk explicitly about racism. And that hasn't gone away. So yes, you saw that in the police riots or the riots over police brutality in Israel. And you see that in a variety of ways. But the Ethiopian community is not all of a piece in thinking about this. For example, my friend Rabbi Sharon Shalom, who is worth having for one of these events also. He's an Ethiopian rabbi and PhD in Jewish studies from Israel. He wrote a book called From Sinai to Ethiopian, trying to reconcile Ethiopian halakha with rabbinic halakha. And he's adamant. I mean, we had him here in Atlanta last year. He's adamant that he doesn't think that race is the right way to frame the relationship between Ethiopians and other Jews, or the problems between Ethiopians and other Jews. He thinks that's a kind of red herring. Many Ethiopians disagree with him, but this is a debate. When I taught in Hebrew University, I had an Ethiopian undergraduate student, a BA student, who wrote an essay trying to argue that gizanut or racism was not really the kind of central feature that many people were trying to make it out to be in relations between Ethiopians and other Israelis. I don't know what he would say if I asked him today, but that's what he wrote, back in the early 2000s. So I think this is race is not a binary. It's not sort of, I'm black or I'm white. It's more who am I allied with and who am I allied against? So Ethiopians racially are Jewish rather than Arab, but they may be Mizrahi rather than Ashkenazi, or they may be Ethiopian rather than Israeli. And a lot of it depends on the context in which the question is asked. So sure, pay close attention to what goes on in America, often a step behind, not as much now since, social media. But if you see something happening in the African American community here, often you'll see reverberations of that in the Ethiopian community a little bit later. I think that has a lot to do with the power of American media of all kinds. So Ethiopian filmmakers make films that explicitly try to capitalize on parallels with the African American experience, partly because they're they're writing for an audience of international film goers, right? So there's a lot of give and take there, but on a political level, there hasn't been a lot of connection or between Ethiopian Jews and African Americans, or let's say take the Black Hebrews as a group of African Americans who moved to Israel and live in some numbers in Israel. There has not been a lot of connection between them and Ethiopian Jews. I think Ethiopian Jews have kept their distance because they understand that Black Hebrews are not going to help them in their claim to be accepted as full Jews in Israel.
Well, you mentioned culture. You mentioned movies. I'm sorry. And that just makes me wonder. And for anyone who follows Israeli culture, it's television, music, cinema, it seems that Ethiopian-Israelis are quite underrepresented. You don't see them. Of course, there are a lot more Russian immigrants from the 1990s, so you see a lot more of them. But you could say that, of that wave of Russian immigrants that came to Israel in the 1990s, there are a lot of them in, actors and musicians and so on. And you don't really see that many Ethiopians. And even if there's supposed to be less of them, numerically speaking, you might still expect to see more than you do. And this may go outside of your area of expertise, but I wonder if you have anything to say about this, about at least what seems to be underrepresentation.
I'm attuned to Ethiopians, so I notice them a lot in Israeli media, but I haven't really done a study of this. It'd be interesting to do. There is a study of Ethiopian music, Ethiopian-Israeli music, and the influence of reggae and by the way, not just African American music, but Ethiopian music, which is in other words, when look at it this way: when Ethiopian Jews came to Israel in the 1980s, so they came as Jews leaving behind Ethiopia. Their musical traditions were not Ethiopian national musical traditions; they were local village Jewish traditions. Right, the same way that Russian Jews were Jews; they weren't Russian, in the late 19th century. Right, they weren't really thought of as Russian in that way. But now, Ethiopian Israelis of all persuasions have really become Ethiopian, in the sense that they also follow the Ethiopian news very closely. They're more upset about the Ethiopian-Eritrean war than they are about anything happening in Syria. And Ethiopian national music, sort of the music of Addis Ababa, as opposed to the music of the village, has become a defining presence in the Ethiopian community. So you can't go to a wedding or a bar mitzvah or anything like that without seeing and hearing dancing and music that would have been alien to the Ethiopian Jews of a couple of decades ago, but is sort of the cosmopolitan music of Ethiopia, which itself is very highly influenced by reggae. So there are a lot of cross currents going on here. I don't know about Israeli cinema. I'm just not sure, but it's a complex business.
All right. So let's go in the few minutes we have left back into those religious questions, because we got a few of them. First, about intermarriage. It used to be, and that again might be a good question if we explain it by race or by really traditions and religion. It used to be that in the early days of the state, and also I know of stories from the 1970s, so at least until then, that even Ashkenazi and Sephardi Israelis wouldn't be so easy. Not that intermarriage didn't happen, but especially on the Ashkenazi side, many people didn't regard it as something that's very desirable. Do we have any of this? I mean, we know that there are couples that are mixed, right? Ethiopians and Israelis who are not Ethiopians, but is there a religious issue there, a racial issue there, or does it just happen more because, I don't know, society advances to a certain point where it matters less?
So I'm not sure. My impression is that among, let's just take Ashkenazim and Mizrahi Israelis today. I think today those barriers have fallen. And I would say most of the couples that I know, at least half of the couples that I know have one partner, who's Ashkenazi and one partner who's some form of Mizrahi or Sephardi, or their parents were. So there's a lot of that. And you see that in the religious traditions. In other words, the prohibition of rice on Passover is falling out of use among Ashkenazi non-Haredi Israelis because, for a lot of reasons, but one reason is if you have a mixed Ashkenazi Sephardic family, it's just very hard to maintain, right? You're going to go to somebody's house, right? You're going to be served rice.
Everything is rice, right?
Right, everything is rice.
Yeah.
So that you see the development of a Jewish tradition in response to that demographic reality. Now, in the beginning, most of the first intermarriages that I saw between Ethiopians and other Israelis were actually with Anglo Israelis. And in the Orthodox community, I think, first of all. And that's not so surprising because that category of people were people who were coming to Israel with certain kinds of ideas about Jewish inclusiveness and coming out of sort of anti-racism movements in the United States, and were kind of sensitive to those issues in a way that Israelis weren't yet. And the religious thing bound them together more than the racial or ethnic thing kept them apart. I don't think that's true anymore. I think that you see Ethiopians marrying people all over the spectrum of Israeli religiosity. Again, other than Ashkenazi Haredim, right? But other than that sector, you see Ethiopians all over the place. And, I can't say that there's no racial bias anymore. That would be a strong statement to make. But I'd like to point out that there's some racial bias in the other direction, which is that there's some Ethiopians who don't want to marry outside of their community. And that's because they want to hold on to their cultural or ethnic identity. One of the open secrets of the Ethiopian community in Israel is that Ethiopian Jews came to Israel with family servants or slaves who were not Jewish, but were registered by the state as members of the family because they would immigrate all together. And the guy would say, yeah, these are my 8 sons. But one of the sons was actually a slave, right, from a different ethnic group in Ethiopia, which was known as Barya. And this was a phenomenon among both Jews and Christians in highland Ethiopia. They had slaves who came from other Ethiopian ethnic groups. And it wasn't talked about for a long time, but it's now out. People have even published about it. And it's not something people love to talk about. But the stereotype for a long time of an Ethiopian who married a white person was they must be a slave because that's the only reason they couldn't find an Ethiopian spouse. And there was some truth to that. In other words, because the Ethiopians amongst themselves know who each other are. And there was definitely a strong bias, if you were Ethiopian, against marrying somebody from that class, right? They kept kind of careful genealogies and they didn't want to intermarry with each other or with somebody whose family had become Christian, right? The so-called the Falashmura. Now that's relaxed a little bit, but there wasn't a lot of intermarriage there at first. And so those kind of outlying Ethiopian groups had a strong interest in marrying out before the rest of Ethiopians did. So I think there's a fair amount of Ethiopian and non-Ethiopian marriage now, racial bias for sure, but it's not a one-directional story. And I can't say that every parent is thrilled to have an Ethiopian come home with their child. I don't know, but it happens enough that I don't think it's that outlandish anymore or weird. It's not something that would be on the news. It's just something that happens. And when I was in Israel on sabbatical, my kids' class had children of Ethiopian and mixed Ethiopian, non-Ethiopian couples. And I think it's just become sort of the, part of the pottage of Israeli life. It's not really something so extraordinary anymore. And that's also for the better. I think.
All right. That's great. I wonder if the last few minutes that we have, there's a way you could, I'm trying to combine a few questions here to see how many of them we can squeeze in. But if you could say, if there are any other sort of very clear differences between Ethiopian Jewish practices and what would be rabbinic Jewish practices, and also if there is any relationship between their leader, the Kes or Kesim, and Kohanim. I mean, if they see it that way, or is there an actual established connection somehow?
That's a good question. Okay, so let me try to parse this out. So first of all, Kes is actually a word that Ethiopian Jews use, but that was originally used by Christians to talk about their priests. The kind of native Ethiopian Jewish word is Kahanat, which is related to the Kohanim, but it's not a hereditary designation. It is you can study to become a Kes. And so even though they sometimes describe them as Kohanim, it's not the same category. They're not a family group or a tribal group, and they're not recognized as Kohanim by other communities in Israel. So in an Ethiopian synagogue, the Kesim don't get up to do the Birkat Kohanim, right? They function more like prayer leaders rather than like Kohanim. So there's some connection conceptually there, but it's not a close conceptualization. In terms of religious practice, again, this is going to run the gamut because it depends whether you're talking about a family that identifies as Orthodox or Masorti or that tries to hold on to Ethiopian traditions. But to the extent that they are kind of traditional Ethiopians, the differences are profound. Ethiopian Jews in Ethiopia didn't have Hebrew. They didn't have a Hebrew Torah scroll. They didn't have a Torah scroll. They used a Bible that was written in Ethiopic on folios, right? So the very basic rituals are different. Purity and impurity were strongly observed. Slightly different rules of slaughter. In some communities, circumcision of boys was on the 7th day rather than the 8th day. Animal sacrifice, I mentioned, although that's not really practiced so much today. A spirit possession, by the way, even though it's not a formal, I guess, part of Ethiopian Judaism, very common in the older community. Along with exorcisms and sacrificing of chickens to the spirits and different kinds of things like that, which is part of, religion from an anthropological point of view, even if it's not sort of classical Judaism. And I would say the Ethiopian tradition was not textual. In other words, there's no equivalent to the rabbinic Talmud of people sort of reading texts closely and asking questions and going back and forth. They tended to read the Bible pretty straightforwardly and apply it. So take a concept which is common in rabbinic Judaism, like pikuach nefesh dochet Shabbat, right? Saving a life takes precedence over Sabbath observance. Okay, that's a principle that's derived in the Talmud in a kind of complicated way. That wasn't a part of Ethiopian practice, right? There was no idea of setting aside the Sabbath to save somebody's life. If you happen to get sick or injured on the Sabbath, you unfortunately probably died. Or broke the Sabbath and, dealt with the consequences of that. But so to the extent that they look at the rabbinic tradition, sometimes they think, well, this is not really authentic Judaism. Look, it's, there's all this stuff in there that's not biblical, right? They didn't have tefillin, which is not explicit in the Bible. They had a different calendar. So although they had a day corresponding to Yom Kippur, it wasn't the same day observed by Jews anywhere else. So there were many, many, many differences. And what's happened in Israel is that many of those differences have gone away. So, for instance, there's nobody in Israel today keeping the traditional Ethiopian Jewish calendar, right? They all observe, if they observe Yom Kippur, they observe it on the day that other Jews do. And recently, an Ethiopian rabbi wrote a luach, right, an Ethiopian Jewish calendar, but even he doesn't want people to practice it. He's just trying to give children, and people some appreciation of their heritage. But Ethiopian Jews have been torn between a desire to hold on to aspects of their tradition and a desire to fit in and become one with the rest of Israeli Judaism. The main topic of Sharon Shalom's book, which I recommend, it's translated into English from Sinai to Ethiopia, is trying to reconcile that. So let me just give you I'll give you maybe the most salacious example, and then it'll give you inclination to call him and invite him, tell him that I sent you. So you know that in rabbinic Judaism, married couples separate not just during the period of a woman's menstruation, but for 7 days after that, before she goes to the mikvah. Okay, that's a rabbinic addition, and it wasn't observed in Ethiopia. So in Israel, you sometimes have the phenomenon of, let's say, even two Ethiopians who are married, but the woman becomes Ba'alat Tshuva. She becomes observant again. That happens in the Ethiopian community just like in the rest of Israel. But the husband does not, right? So now they have a negotiation because she wants to observe Taharat HaMishpacha, laws of kind of marriage. He doesn't, right? Kind of common dispute that a couple might have. So they strike a bargain where he says, fine, you want me to do this, I'll do this, but I want to keep it the Ethiopian way. I don't want to do it in the rabbinic way, right? So 5 days instead of 12, right? It's better deal for me. And Sharon Shalom, faced that question as a rabbi in Israel and had to kind of balance, wanting to be a Jew like other Jews and wanting to preserve those traditions. In that case, in his book, at least, you can ask him what he thinks now. But in his book, he says, look, for first and second generation Ethiopians, it makes sense, even for rabbis, to give them some flexibility and observe Ethiopian traditions if that makes life easier for them. But in the book, he certainly is of the opinion that over time, the Ethiopian practice ought to come to correspond much more closely to the rabbinic practice, simply because, again, there's a lot of intermarriage. They want there to be a lot of intermarriage. They want those barriers to go away. The halachic differences between Ashkenazim and Sephardim are minor. Eating rice on Pesach is a big deal, but that's minor from a Jewish legal point of view. It's just a custom. So the differences between Ethiopian Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism are major. And maintaining those differences will make it very hard for people to intermix those communities. So I think Ethiopian Jews have been under a lot of pressure and have imposed a lot of pressure on themselves to moderate those differences in order, as they put it, to have unity of the Jewish people. And that's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process. Anyway, I'm happy to stay on, but I know you set an hour limit for the event.
I mean, I'm just tempted to ask you one question that sort of sums up everything.
It's fine with me. Go ahead.
So my question is this: do you feel, and it's a question to you both as a scholar and an Orthodox Jew, if you don't mind, because I'm really curious. Do you feel all that work that you've done?
What gave me away?
Well, I know you. That's what gave it away.
All right, but, sure. I shaved today and everything. Yeah, go ahead.
Anyways, that work that you've done, all of these people that you know and what you've seen and everything you shared with us tonight, a lot of that is not, how, as you yourself said, that's not how other Jews, Ashkenazi or Sephardi Jews, practice their Judaism. So would it be a logical conclusion to say there is more than one Judaism? We should be talking about Judaisms. There are different ways to be Jewish, and it doesn't have, those other ways, they don't have to be my way, meaning I won't practice Judaism this way, but I recognize that that's another way to be Jewish. Is that, in your view, a legitimate conclusion?
Well, it's certainly legitimate. The question is, what are the consequences of it? And this is something I deal with both as a scholar and in personal life. So it's become very popular in general Jewish studies language to talk about Judaisms rather than Judaism. Right. I have no problem with that. That's a valid way of describing a complicated phenomenon, but it's not the only way of describing it. And the question is really whether you focus more on differences or similarities. And that's the same question that faced Ethiopian Jews and other Jews 100 years ago as they tried to decide, are we related to each other? So do you focus on the differences, we have all these religious differences, or do you focus on the similarities? We all are thinking about return to Jerusalem. We all celebrate the seventh-day Sabbath. We all have similar laws of kashrut. We all have a Hebrew Bible from which the New Testament has been excluded. So, there are a lot of differences which catch our attention, but there are also many things that are shared. And both as a matter of interpretation and as a matter of politics, I don't think there's an objective answer to this question. I think you have to make a determination about, and hopefully an honest one, about what you want to emphasize and on what grounds, right? So I don't think the question, is this Judaism, is an objective question. I think it's an interpretive question. And first you have to ask what counts. Now, the rabbinic tradition has its own criteria, for what counts, which it has developed over, millennia. And it's not going to change drastically. Now, Ethiopian Jews, when they came to Israel, had an option if they wanted it. They still have an option if they want it, to take on a status something more like the Karaites in Israel, which means that Karaites, those of you who know, Karaites are a medieval sect originating in the Middle Ages, who are Jewish, sort of ethnically, but they're ethnic and religiously, but their religion does not include what rabbinic Jews call the oral law. Okay, it's a religion based strictly on. They reject the Talmud and everything that goes with it. They do have their own interpretive tradition, it turns out, because you can't really read the Bible without one. But it's framed much more narrowly on scripture, right, than on the Talmud. And in the Middle Ages, these two forms of Judaism existed side by side in many places, right? In Egypt, Maimonides, had to decide, how to treat Karaite Jews who might want to intermarry with rabbinic Jews, or rabbinic Jews who did Karaite customs, right? And this was a common thing that he had to deal with, and he dealt with harshly in some cases and less harshly in others. So this goes back a long way. If Ethiopian Jews had wanted to proclaim a status for themselves similar to Karaites in Israel are called Yehudim Karaim. Right, that's what it says in their documents, right? Karaite Jews, which means that it's sort of an intermediate status. They are Jews with respect to the state in some ways, but when they come to marry or whatever, the rabbinate is not going to marry them to a rabbinic Jew unless they forswear their Karaite Judaism. And they have their own religious courts, and they sort of, just like sort of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Israel under the Ottoman system, all have their own religious courts and their own kind of family law. So Karaites also are a recognized group with their own family law. And the chief rabbinate doesn't give them orders what to do. And they maintain themselves as a separate community. The Samaritans also in Israel are a separate religious community, although they have many, many historical, existential ties with what we call Judaism. Now, Ethiopian Jews could have sought some sort of a status like that. They could have said, we want to come and live in Jerusalem, in Israel, Yerushalayim as they call it, which is, our historical dream of millennia. But really, really, we're not so interested in this newfangled rabbinic religion. We're going to kind of do what we want. And we'll have our own religious authorities that are recognized by the state, and our own system of kashrut and our own system of marriage, and just leave us alone and we'll do our own thing. And they probably could have had that, but I don't know any Ethiopian in Israel who wants that. In other words, even the ones who want to maintain their tradition in as much of a pristine form as they can, want it to be done in such a way that they are part of the overall Jewish community in terms of marriage, in terms of political identity, in terms of burial in cemeteries, in terms of a million and one things that are all wrapped up together in this, right? Including political identity, because there's not the same separation of church and state as there is in the United States. They want to be included within that sort of mass of, I guess, Jews, rabbinic Jews, for lack of a better term. It was even secular Israelis are rabbinic Jews in the sense, right? The religion that they reject is rabbinic Judaism. It's not biblical Judaism or Karaite Judaism or anything else. The synagogue they don't go to is a rabbinic synagogue. And many of them do go sometimes, right? For a life cycle event or something else. So to the extent that Ethiopian Jews want to be part of that and are a very small minority, there's really no choice but to adapt some of that majority religious culture. And from what I have seen, the vast majority are happy to do so as long as they can maintain those traditions that are really important to them. Like, I haven't seen any Ethiopian religious person object to moving the day of Yom Kippur to the day that's celebrated in Israel. If you think about it, that's a momentous change, the change of the calendar, right? In Jewish history, splits between different subsets or sects have turned on which calendar you choose. The Sadducees and the Pharisees argued about the calendar. And in the temple in Jerusalem, they used to throw rocks at each other for observing the wrong Sabbath or the wrong Yom Kippur because they had different calendars, right? So the fact that Ethiopian Jews are universally willing to accept the Hebrew calendar tells me a lot about how they see themselves and their destiny going forward. Now, does that mean that they have to conform in all respects to what happens in the rest of Jewry? So certainly not as an anthropologist. I mean, I think that's not what's happening, right? There's something much more organic mixing and matching taking place. And if you want to ask me, from my personal view as a rabbinic Jew, so I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm in favor of maximum flexibility, but it's a sensitive matter to figure out where that flexibility resides. In other words, from a rabbinic Jewish viewpoint, it's much easier to be flexible when the Ethiopian tradition is more strict than it is when the Ethiopian tradition is more lenient. That's right. So for example, allowing or teaching that couples can sleep together after the end of menstruation, but before the 7 days, is very, very hard for rabbinic Judaism to swallow. It's a very, very old custom from hoary antiquity. But if Ethiopian Jews want to maintain more strict laws of Passover, because in Ethiopia, it wasn't just bread you couldn't eat any fermented product, right? So they didn't drink wine, they didn't eat cheese, right? Anything that was fermented was considered not kosher for Passover.
Yeah.
So if Ethiopian Jews want to observe that, I don't think rabbinic Jews have much ability to complain, right? I mean, they have their own longstanding tradition, and if they don't make kiddush on wine, right? So it's not what a rabbinic Jew does, but it's not a huge, that's not a sect creating difference. Now, where this plays out in practice in the existential terms, where the rubber hits the road, is when these things are mixed within families. And that's really what gave Sharon Shalom the impetus to write his book, because a very common occurrence is that a young Ethiopian student goes to a religious high school, off to boarding school for high school, or learns about religion while they're in the army or whatever. They become an Orthodox Jew, and then they come home for a holiday or a wedding, and there's tremendous tension because either they don't want to eat in their parents' kitchen, which is something that happens in America too, but Ethiopians are, very insulted by this. A child is not going to eat in my kitchen. That's, a disaster. Or they don't want to kiss relatives of the opposite sex, right? Because rabbinic Judaism tends to frown on this unless it's a very, very close relative. But in Ethiopian culture, everybody kisses everybody. It's like France, everybody's kissing each other on the cheeks all the time. So now this kid comes home from yeshiva and he doesn't want to kiss his aunt. And for Ethiopians, that's just asocial behavior. Like, you can't do that. There's something wrong with you, right? If you behave that way. And so that creates terrible conflict between children and parents. So Sharon Shalom wrote his book basically to find what he thought would be fair solutions that could be recognized by halakha, but also make space for Ethiopian tradition that would allow these kind of problems to be dealt with. Not everybody accepts his solutions. In other words, some of the kids, who went to yeshiva high school that he's writing for don't like his book, although it's a popular book, but they don't like it because they feel like they've made the change already, right? They've become rabbinic Jews in every way. And the idea of now having to go back and rethink these things, they find very upsetting or unraveling. But on the other hand, for their parents, telling the child, look, fine, you don't want to eat the meat slaughtered by the kes, fine. Many families have two sets of meat and they have a celebration. The kes brings a goat and they slaughter it, and they also go to the supermarket and buy schnitzel or whatever. And I've been to many weddings where I'm served schnitzel and the children are served schnitzel and the parents are eating a goat someplace. And that's all manageable. That's all manageable. But when you say also, I won't eat anything in your house, and also I won't kiss my aunt when she comes over to visit, that's like intolerable. So he's interested in finding solutions to these problems. he has another creative thing that he tries to do, which is even more controversial. He believes that the distance between Rabbinic Judaism and Ethiopian Judaism is not as great as many people believe. But again, the question is, what counts as similar and what counts as different, right? So he goes back to the Talmud and tries to show that the Ethiopian Jewish customs, derive from some minority opinion that's preserved somewhere in rabbinic literature, even if it's not the accepted position. Okay, so just as a quick example, Ethiopians didn't have what rabbinic Jews called tefillin, right, or phylacteries, but there was something similar. There were people who wore kind of amulets out of leather, with verses in them, or it's not exactly what we call tefillin. But his grandfather, who was a kiss, had one of these, and it was white leather. And I've seen this also. It was often white leather, right? White is purity. Now, you've never seen rabbinic tefillin that are white. They don't exist. They're always black. And that's the dominant custom. But he goes back to Maimonides and finds out that according to Maimonides, even according to Maimonides, you don't even have to go back to the Talmud all the time, white is acceptable. It's just not done. So he makes a point of that and tries to show that, where there's room to treat the Ethiopian Jewish tradition as normative under the halachic rubric, why not do that? Why not make things simpler rather than insisting on a strict line and make things complicated for people? So, I'm completely on board with that project, but of course it depends what Ethiopian Jews want for themselves. It doesn't matter what I think. And, they have many very capable spokespeople today. I'm almost embarrassed to give these talks because, you may as well have an Ethiopian themselves give the talk, but you've got to make a living. So
we'll do that for next time, I'm sure.
Right. And I'm happy to, I've done it with him, by the way, also, where we kind of have a give and take. But from my point of view, I'm very happy that Ovadia Yosef existed, because from a halachic point of view, he's a big enough nail on which to hang my hat. In other words, if I had fallen in love with an Ethiopian, I would have married them under Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's ruling, even though most Ashkenazi authorities didn't agree. But Ovadia Yosef is a world-class halachic authority that very few people can match, and so thank God he existed. And in general, this feeds into a larger question, which I won't get into right now. But in general, in modern Judaism and in Israel, there's a big question: what is the future of these ethnic Judaisms going forward? In other words, will there continue to be separate Ashkenazic and Sephardic Judaism or not? Should there be two chief rabbis or just one? Sure, but I'll step last sentence. I have a synagogue here in Atlanta, which is a small Ashkenazi synagogue, which is in the process of merging with a small Persian synagogue, right? And we're going to have a building with two separate minyanim, one board of directors, two rabbis, right? That's the vision going forward. Why? Why not have just one minyan? The truth is, during the week, not on Shabbat, we have one minyan because the Sephardim don't have enough people who want to come on Tuesday, right? And we have more people who want to come on Tuesday, so they join us. So is the future of American or Israeli Judaism in the maintenance of these kind of ethnic and geographical boundaries or not? What's at stake? What's really at stake? And both rabbinic authorities and rabbinic lay people argue about this all the time. I think that demographics are what's going to decide the issue rather than what rabbis decide. That's really what I think.
All right. Well, this has been fascinating and eye-opening, and to me at least left many questions, but don't worry, everyone else, we're done with the questions for now. This has been great. And I want to thank you very much for speaking.
And by the way, if
tonight.
anybody has serious questions, whatever, you can get my email from Yaron. Feel free to write to me. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. And thank you all. And we hope to see you in our upcoming events. Thank you. Good night.
Cheers.